this really is, conversational mastery. And this is a series that kind of sort of started last year, starting to build. And this series is, I'm calling it the Conversational Mastery Series. And it really does equal better conversations. The more that we can understand what happens when we have conversations, the better chance we have of having the outcomes that we might be looking for. So we tend to say, if you can change your conversation, it will influence. You can't really change another person's mind. You can influence them, but you may change their heart, mind, philosophies, but you can certainly help to change outcomes. So it's not about being a better talker. It's really about being a better listener, having some empathy, understanding what underpins all of that, and let's say, I think knowing when to speak more or speak less in many ways. There is a whole neuroscience behind this, which I covered off more in last year's session, so that you can go and have a look at. But before we continue, I'd like you to do a poll. I want you to think about this for a moment. Just think about where you are at this moment. Take a breath, close your eyes if you wish to, and just notice what's going on inside of you. Pay attention to yourself. What are you feeling? What do you think what your emotions might be? Where are you feeling it? Just think about those sensations that you have in this moment, and then look at this poll, and on a scale of 0, I am not okay, to 10, I am very okay, let us know where you are on that number. And we'll just see where everybody is just now. There we go. So we already have a variation. So wherever we are at the moment, sometimes there'll be days when we feel very okay and other days that we're not. And this is what we call state. So let me continue. I'll talk about state in a moment, but before that, this session today really is about how assumptions shape what we notice, what we believe, and how we respond to things that we're observing. So the skill is in noticing what's shaping our conversations before the word is even spoken. We often think that just because we've spoken, the world will understand us, but there is an awful lot going on inside of us before that even happens. So the words that come out, the language that we use, is after a whole series of other processes that have happened within our actual physical selves. So with that in mind, and really the assumptions here about is the assumptions we're making. They're the ones that we're going to talk about today. It's not so much about what we're seeing out there. It's more about what assumptions do we make before we even start a conversation. So the session objective really is to think about where might your assumptions be shaping your conversations without you even realizing it. And once we understand assumptions, and we all have some ideas about what assumptions are, but how much they actually influence how a conversation that we have is really interesting. And if we talk about how to have safety conversations, what assumptions do we make, particularly in the heat of the moment? What state are we in? So, and hence state is important. So I mentioned earlier that we did this, that we started this process, this series last year, and last year's conversation really focused on state, which we're going to check in a minute. So that's really about how do your thoughts and your feelings affect your conversations. And today we're going to move into the assumptions part, which is the second module of this 5-module Better Conversations framework. So what are we making up when we're in conversation, leading into a conversation and then in the conversation? We as humans are really good at storytelling, and we tell ourselves amazing stories, which may or may not be set in fact. once we get to that, the third module is context. So context also is very important, and context matters a lot. And if we think about that from doing risk assessments or how to have those conversations, how do we change the way things happen, context matters. Listening is a very key tool in this whole process, and listening with curiosity is a key skill that we can learn, but it's not always easy for us to do, because we tend to walk into a conversation listening to our own thoughts. So the trick here is then to, how do we stop listening to our own listening? That therefore leads us into, how do we have purposeful and intentional conversations, and particularly if we're looking for things like behavioural change. So let's have a little review of state to start with. So the state looks, as I said, mentions how do your thoughts and feelings affect your conversation. We talk about this in the 3-state model. We can call it the traffic light model, however we wish to look at it. But our emotional and mental state impacts our conversations, or how we approach a conversation before it even begins, before we even do all the other elements. All right. So let's have a look. So thinking about your numbers that you just put forward in the poll. Okay, that's fine. If you're in the red state, it means that your numbers, or the number that you gave yourself and how you're feeling just now, was between 0 and 4, then that red state means you should probably stop, take a break, take a breath, take care of yourself. And you should certainly take care of yourself, because you're not okay. You might be feeling some sort of emotions. You might be in an uncomfortable scenario. Don't know what context you're in, of course, right? You might be in a little bit of fight, flight, freeze. You might be thinking, why am I on this workshop? Why do I have to come again to these things? Although I'd like to think everybody's come because they wanted to. But somewhere what's important here is that some of your basic needs are not being met. And you may well feel that your own well-being is being threatened in some way. So if you're in that state and you have to go and have a conversation with somebody else about something they've done or not done, then how might that conversation work out? Right? Now, likewise, if you're at the other end of that scale and you were somewhere between 7 and 10, and I noticed there were quite a few here, you're in the green state and you're good to go. You're feeling good, you're feeling connected with yourself, with others, and you're probably going to be more open to opportunity, to listening to others, being more engaging, and you will probably then come into the conversation as your best self. Right? When we're in the red state, we tend to be more protective. We're going to be focused more on ourselves and focused inwards. When we're in green, we'll be looking at what's going on around us and be more open. And of course, if you're in that 4 to 7 range, you're going to be in that yellow state, and we say proceed with caution. And that doesn't mean that you can't go and have an important conversation. It just means, do I need to go and take a few breaths? Do I need to just check in with myself? What do I need to do to be as good as I can be for this next conversation or interaction? And some of the things to think about here is, think about your last difficult conversation. You don't have to do this right now, but whenever you're thinking about the state that you're in, using the traffic light model is a nice, simple visual. You can use this with your teams. You can share this. You can use it. You will get access to this at the end of this session. And it's a really lovely, simple way to check into one's emotions. We can use it to help people be more open, I guess, about how they're actually feeling. So that was a quick review of state. Now we're going to look a little bit more at the assumptions part. As I said, there is an invitation at the end of this where you can join in. I have this course actually available in my leadership community, and you can actually take yourself through it again. So let's look at this in a little more depth. When we talk about assumptions, we're talking about what are the stories that we're making up? What do we assume when we observe somebody? What do we assume is happening? What are the feelings that we're getting? Yeah. So we call this the sense and respond model. So how do we move forward? So let's have a look a little bit deeper at this. The sense and respond model looks at what's the external stimulus? How am I being stimulated? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? Which then leads to how we feel. What am I thinking? Where are the stories coming from? How am I feeling right now? This is what we call our internal state. And then what happens next, the external response, is how we behave, how we show up. It's what we say and do. Now, this is only one half of the equation. When we talk about context, we look at this as this is how it represents me. But of course, this is also how it represents the other person. And if there's a disconnect there, then you can imagine we might have that conversation that's not going quite to plan. So another way to look at this from sometimes what I use is if I talk about a little bit of neuroscience and brain technology, let me call it that. We have multiple brains, 6 at the moment in terms of conversational intelligence. And one of the important ones is our gut. Now, our gut sends a lot of information upwards. So if you think about what you see and hear, then immediately you're going into what do I think? What am I feeling? And some of this is happening very unconsciously, and it happens very quickly. So if you think about your gut is here, you've got some sensations, it then comes through up into this region here of the brain, which is our emotional state. We then get some sensations. This is what we call the fast thinking brain. And then by the time we get to speak, it's come here to the prefrontal cortex. And if this is not in a good state, then what comes out of our mouths may not be the best outcome. So it's important to have a think about this, all about what am I seeing, what am I hearing, what's stimulating me at the moment, what state am I in right now, and then how do I choose to respond? Now, obviously, this is only one piece of the puzzle. We are different people, we have different personality styles, there's a whole range of other elements to us, right? But this is then what the more that we look at this, the better understanding we have, we can think about what we do next. So let's have a little bit look more at what I see and hear, our external stimuli. Right? So mostly it's our tone of voice, body language, what are we seeing, what are the words we're hearing, the timing, but we never take everything in. And this is then where the brain kicks in and starts to create the stories. It fills the gaps between what we're actually seeing, what we're feeling, and then what we end up assuming. So we do tend to notice very selectively. And if you think of 2 people in a conversation and they're both having these reactions, then there's going to be some disconnect, there's potential for misunderstandings, that's when they happen. Right? So individuals will focus on the information that's important to them. So one way to understand it is to ask yourself the question, what am I actually seeing or hearing here? What's important? Take a breath. Think about it. Think about state. And think about what you're hearing and seeing. We then go into what I think and feel. So now that internal state. Right? So this is where the real processing happens. We interpret what we've just heard. Our thinking and feelings are intertwined here. As I say, the slow and fast thinking brains start to get very active, and we start to make meaning. We decide what's important for us, and we start to form those assumptions. And this happens very quickly. And then we move to the I see, I do, the external response. So this is the last step. So how we respond now is how we speak, the words that we use, what type of questions we might be asking, and that's a whole nother session in itself. You know, when are we going to stay silent? Are we going to get into that fear, fright? Sorry, I'll take that back. You know, do we move in or do we step back from the conversation? So this is now where the behaviors show up. So this is the tip of the iceberg, if you like. So everything else that we've just talked about is what's happening below the surface. And then how we speak, how we respond, how we physically show up is what happens next. So that's in that whole respond process. So this is an activity that I thought we could all do together. Well, everybody in your space have a go at doing this. So the first thing I want you to think about is the stories that we tell yourself. So what I want you to do, first step, is to look around you. It can be at another person, it can be something on the screen, it can be an item that you have on your desk. And I want you now to use that pen and paper and just for a moment, write down 2 or 3 sentences that describe what you think is happening. What is it that you're observing? What do you see? The second part to this is now when you think about what you've written, have a look at what are actual facts, what is an interpretation, and therefore what might you be assuming? And where might those assumptions come from? So the third part to this activity is now I want you to rewrite your description in a completely different way. So think about what you first wrote. So it's the same situation, but rewrite it with a different meaning and see what you discover. So again, these are activities that we can do to help us to slow down a little bit, stop and think about, I'm about to go into a safety conversation, let's say, what is this conversation about? I always caveat all of these discussions with, if somebody is in imminent danger, that's not the time to go and have a stop and have a lovely conversation. That's the time to move on, yeah? But every other time, all of these will help you improve your conversational skills. And my thoughts, I heard an ongoing reversing alarm triggered me to think that the truck is struggling, but perhaps they were just taking their time to do their job safely. Interesting, right? It's the same about, yeah, because the other person is going through exactly the same process, yeah? Yep. Anyway, I was on a call yesterday. Doubt is such an important word in the world that we live in. I heard a comment yesterday that, we often talk about chronic unease, which kind of sounds, well, he actually described it as constipated, which I thought was rather interesting. But really what safety is in many ways, what we're really looking for is that little bit of doubt to help us to move forward. We do need that little bit of doubt. That's what risk assessment might be about. Right? It's not about perfection. It's about how do we look for, and having a healthy amount of doubt is probably a good thing. Yeah, so good. Okay. So I'm going to introduce you to a slightly more, another look at this actually, something called the ladder of conclusions. So when we walk up the ladder of conclusions, so we're about to go into a conversation, and where we tend to, when we start on this journey, the ladder of conclusions, and particularly with difficult conversations, how many times have we had, get ourselves into a bit of a state because we're going to have a difficult conversation with someone. Now, many people on this call are going to be trained to how to have conversations, but how often do they actually land the way that you want them to? And I think that's a really important component to this whole question about the types of conversations that we have. Statistically, 9 out of 10 conversations miss the mark, which is rather large. So this process of mastering your conversations is about how do we reduce that so that more often when we get involved in conversations, they actually is the only conversation that we need to have to move things forward. Yeah, for sure. Biases are in our assumptions are there all the time. We are assumption-making machines. That's being human is about having assumptions. Yeah. So when we walk up this, what we call the ladder of conclusions, it, as I said a little bit earlier, it actually starts with in the gut. We have gut reactions. Now, some of them are very visceral and we are very strong. or they can be quite gentle and maybe not hardly noticeable. But that is where a lot of this actually starts. And this is because of our chemical cocktails as well, of oxytocin and cortisol. These get mixed up and they start to impact the conversations that we have. So those reactions then become our feelings. Those then become our thoughts. That's when we start to create meaning. That's where we start to make stuff up. Our beliefs, our values, our interpretations get involved here, and we come to conclusions, and these are the assumptions that we're making. And that's usually when we step into the conversation, once all of that has happened. Yeah? So we speak from the top of that ladder of conclusion. We select the data, we add meaning. Our biases are a very big part of this, you know, and there's a lot of them which we won't get into just now. So what is really happening here? So the next piece then is, well, how do we walk back down that ladder of conclusions? Yeah. So stepping down the ladder of conclusions is, particularly if you know that you're going to go into a conversation, it's probably a little bit harder to do, but with practice, you can do this quite quickly. Think about, you know, if you're going to go and have a difficult conversation with somebody, maybe prepare yourself a little bit. Arrange to have take that person to the side. Don't always do it in public, of course. I think most of us probably already know that. But in the heat of the moment, sometimes we forget, right? And be clear on your intention and desire. So this is you practicing within yourself what you want to have a conversation about. Right? Then connect with the individual. Go and have that conversation. Set the context. So what is it that you've observed? Try to keep the emotion out of it. What is it that you've observed? Process what's happening for them, and to help form that, start to prepare for a better relationship within that conversation. Then this is a little bit more than just a one-way conversation, what I'm talking about here. So here, when we're coming back down that ladder of conclusions, by sharing the stories, by sharing what each person is feeling or observing and what they are making up themselves without calling it that. Really important here to be that listening without judgment is a very important key. That way you can understand the impact that you're having on each other. So the more open that people can be with this. And therefore, that also opens up the door to exploring the impact on everyone else around us. And then we get to that point of agree on action. So we start to look at this from a partnering perspective. How do we partner with the other person? We understand each other. We think about what needs to happen. What's the commitment? How do we check in again and give feedback? So this is what we're calling, say, the ladder of conclusions. So at first we tend to climb up it. But if we don't want to start from that position, think about, where do we want this conversation to go? What are the assumptions I am making? Are they valid? Try and sort out the fact from fiction. Not always easy to do, because we're going to work on what our experience base is. So that's quite a bit there, is that you will be getting some information on this as well. So next activity here is, now I really want you to think about a recent safety conversation, but it could be any conversation. What assumptions did you make before? So think about so take a moment, think about a recent conversation that you had. It might have been a safety conversation. It might have been just another conversation that you were in. But when you think about conversations, many of them start from a point of safety anyway, right? Am I safe to contribute to this conversation? So what assumptions did you make before starting that conversation? Now, you can just add that into the chat, actually. As we say, putting yourself in their shoes. Absolutely, Darren. We talk about standing under the umbrella of others is another way of saying that. Yeah. So thinking about a conversation that you had, a recent conversation, how did it go? What assumptions did you make before starting that conversation? And feel free to just continue sharing it in the chat. There isn't a pop-up. Don't worry about that. You thought it was going to be easy, straightforward. I'm guessing by that statement it wasn't necessarily. That they understood the issue. But did they? Yeah. We often think because we speak that the world understands us, and it's quite the opposite. Thing to remember is that we all observe the world from our own perspective, from our own lens, our own bias, our own beliefs, our own values, our own assumptions. Assumed non-compliance before opening the conversation. Yeah. That they didn't want to do it. So before starting, I was thinking it was getting late. Interesting. Yeah. Assumed that they had a similar mindset. Was it the right time and place? Could it wait? Yeah. I feel for you that it was another thing that had to be dealt with. Yeah. And of course, this is where the next piece of the puzzle, context, is so important when we talk about pressure, time, who needs what and when. Yeah. So technical knowledge level as others in the audience of the subject at hand. Yeah. Yeah. They have family and friends at home and wanting them to come back safely. Absolutely. So of those assumptions, I'm just going to make this a poll just to make it a little bit interesting. Oh, more paperwork, yes. All right. Of all of the assumptions that you're thinking about, did they ring true? Yes or no? No, most of the time. I don't know about but there are times when I think, oh, I've got to go and have this conversation with somebody, and it's going to be like this. And I've actually lain awake at night worrying about a conversation that I had to go and have, and I can remember saying to myself, oh, sorry, I keep doing this. Ben, I think this is me doing this. Yeah, thank you. Right. Yes, no. Okay, interesting split, actually, but still more on the nose. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's so many types of difficult conversations that we might be having. We think about a safety conversation. Sometimes we talk about, right, we want to stop somebody. We can see that somebody's not doing something right. Do we intervene? Do we interject? How do we do that? What assumptions are we making as we're moving towards the person to stop the job? What assumptions do we make when people don't stop the job? Right? So, yeah, there is lots of different scenarios. So assumptions shape the quality, are one of the contributing factors, I would like to say here, actually, that shape the quality of our conversations. They will help us to understand whether people are feeling safe, whether they can stay curious, and this includes yourself, whether that dialogue that we're about to have actually opens up the conversation or shuts it down. And the really key thing here is, it's about learning. All of these conversations, how do we learn from each other? And I think in addition to understanding what assumptions we're making, this comes down to also what listening, what stories, how do we listen? How do we stop listening to ourselves? There's been a couple of times where I've actually stood in front of the mirror and I've literally said to myself, just stop doing that. It actually works. Sounds a little strange, but it actually works. And have a better conversation with yourself before you go into the next conversation. As does breath work. It does also help, particularly if we're feeling anxious and if our state is not in the green zone, but we might be nearing the red zone. How do we calm that state down? Because the more we're in that red state, of course, the higher our assumptions, our bias, our misunderstandings will occur. Yeah. Yeah, oh, great. It does work. Yeah. So this is a short session, really is just an invitation for you to explore assumptions through observing, stepping back, reflecting a little bit more, taking that moment before you, particularly if you're in that sort of amber to red state, moving forward. But you've also got to think about what state might the other person be in. You don't, of course, know that particularly, but you may get a sense of, particularly if it's working with people that you've seen, that you know reasonably well. So notice what you're seeing and hearing when you're interacting with people. You know, what assumptions are you making in those interactions, and are those assumptions accurate? There is an acronym out of the assumption. So assume is an us of me and you, is another way of looking at it. It most definitely is, Darren. It is a close link to how we contribute to the within organisational culture, most definitely. So the hardest assumptions to challenge are the ones we don't realise we're making. The hardest assumptions to challenge are the ones we don't realise we're making. So step back, have a think about what assumptions you're making before you actually start the interaction. Consider the ladder of conclusions. Are we walking up it or are we walking down? Yeah, I hadn't actually put that in here. So remember at the beginning, the objective was like, how might your assumptions be shaping your conversations without you realizing it? So this is the action, the takeaway from this conversation. All right. So to change our conversations, minds, and outcomes, consider your state and then what the assumptions are that you're making. We talked about state, that 3-state traffic light model, and please feel free to share that. And then, of course, the assumptions, the sense and respond model. So think about how you see, hear, think, feel before you say and do. I've just... I'm sorry, I just saw that. Have you tried to have a conversation with AI before you had it with the person close up? No. That might be interesting. That could be helpful. However, at the moment, my conversations with my AI are getting slightly annoying. But yes. It is interesting to test your own waters, actually. I mean, and using AI, all jokes aside, can be very helpful. Just to help clarify your own thinking. So thank you, everybody. And let's see what questions we might have. Yay.
Thank you ever so much, Karin. Yeah, we've got a few questions. So the first one came in from Emily, Emily James. And what she asks is, you mentioned 6 brains from a neuroscientific point of view. Yeah. Is there a model of these we can Google?
There is now. So the model that I share is from a body of work that I work on called conversational intelligence. There is also a copy of the 6 brains with the presentation that we did last year, and I also have it inside the community. So yeah, so there are the 6, and the 6 are literally the gut, the heart, and then you've got your amygdala, your emotional, your prefrontal cortex, your memories. So all of these are part of the 6 brains. Yeah. And I should have probably put it in, actually, just to share it because it's quite useful. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to reiterate, I did mention it at the beginning, that the previous webinar that Karin's done is on the IOSH website. And it's relatively easy to find. Another question, what is the difference between assumptions and unconscious bias?
So, well, I think, assumptions, good question, actually. Let me think about that for a moment before I'm blurting something ridiculous. So I think our unconscious bias is really what we don't, they kind of play in the same space, to be honest. Yeah. So, but assumptions are things that we're making up, where unconscious bias is not necessarily. It is just part of, I'm trying to think of an example. I think we all have these unconscious bias, that they're a part of us. And I think the biases are actually part of the assumption story. So as we're making up assumptions, there is many, many biases. It could also be confirmation bias, unconscious bias. Believe it or not, there's a thing called the IKEA bias. Anyway, but yes. Yeah.
Thank you. So I've got a question coming from Carl. Let me try and
always remember using the training safety conversations as SUSA, safe and unsafe acts, talking to the person to correct the behaviors, seeing the accident before it happens. Is there any other well-developed ways of having better conversations? I've not heard of SUSA before as a framework. When it comes to safety conversations, I think the most important part of that conversation is asking questions for which you have no answers, meaning you are asking from a point of curiosity. We may assume that we know what that conversation should be, or what the other person thinks they're saying, or thinks we are what the sorry, let me start that again. In the sort of traditional safety conversation framework, we go in with, let me stop the job, let's have a conversation, and then we ask some questions. I think what's really important with some of these questions, I'll come back to that one, Ben, actually, and Sonia. When we talk about questions, I think the types of questions that you ask is probably more important than anything else in a safety conversation. If you go into a conversation starting with why, for example, it may lead down the wrong road. It may make people feel a little bit defensive. So we talk about, I'm being a bit hesitant here only because this is such a big subject that there's a lot I could say. So I think what's really important is you go into these conversations with an open mind, try to stop listening to your stories, and then ask open questions. And we talk about open and closed questions. Most people know that a closed question is a yes or no, and an open question, what you're looking for is you want to pull information from people. Now, unless it's a complete breach of something, that's a slightly different type of conversation. But in general, it's about understanding why a situation is the way it is, or why a person is doing something the way they are doing it, which may or may not be correct. We can only assume that we don't know yet. So we go into that conversation with openness, try to stop listening to ourselves, which means we put those assumptions to the background, try to push some of the biases that we may have into the background, and ask open questions. And a great question might be help me understand the task that you're doing. Even if you know what they're doing, sometimes asking that question will give you a floodgate of information. Help me understand. Describe to me, if a new person was doing this job, would they do it this way? That's a very powerful question. Use it in limited doses. But really look for the hows, the whens. Don't use why with absolute caution. That I will say at this point. And the other thing is there's another frameworks around clean language. So if people are saying, look, I don't get the support that I need, just simply say, and what support is that? My teammates aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Look for the key word here is, and what is that supposed to be doing? What is that? Right? So don't always just leap in with an answer. try and pull information from the person that you're speaking with. I hope that helps. Sort of going around a few circles here, sorry.
Thank you. Thanks. We've got a question. How can we use our assumptions in a useful way in a safety conversation?
That's a really good question. How can we use our assumptions? Maybe being open about them. I'm just trying to think. And it's interesting that you bring up also something around well, there's two questions here. I think there's another one here. I think by bringing them into the conversation. So you might actually say, I'm making an assumption here, and I might be completely off the beaten track or off that, whatever your language is, yeah? I might just say, this is what I've observed, and so I'm making an assumption, but I might be really wrong. Help me understand. That's actually how I would probably do that.
There's a question around extra assumptions that might be made if the conversation is being had over Teams or Zoom, and have you got any thoughts and guidance on managing that? Yeah.
Interesting when you've got remote working, and I've done quite a lot of work in this space, you know, and even what we're doing right in here, you know, I'm sitting here in a world of a sea of assumptions at the moment because I can't actually see anybody, right? So that's a really interesting point. You know, we make assumptions when we can't see things, when we can't touch, feel, see. So that's why, interestingly, cameras on is usually really important, particularly if you're in a meeting, right? How many times are we in meetings? And you make assumptions that, oh, they're not really listening or they're not doing this. So one way to do that, when we're working in this world, the virtual realm, intentionality is really important, and also being upfront. Sometimes it doesn't matter if you're just sharing information, and that's fine, right? But if you want to have an engaging conversation in this space, in an ideal world, you want to have cameras on and also share assumptions. You know, there have been times I've been running workshops and you'll see somebody, now they might have their camera on or they keep flicking on and off, and you sort of think, oh, they must be answering their emails or whatever they're doing. And actually they're not, they're processing. So again, it's asking open questions and actually being a little bit open about what you are assuming, even in this space. But I always like to say to people, if you're going to go into a meeting and you're in the physical room, in the physical realm, you don't walk into a room with the paper bag over your head. So why would you turn your camera off? Sometimes we all have bad hair days. I get that.
Don't we? Got a few minutes left. So next question. What links do you see to assumptions and flight, fight, or freeze?
Quite a few, actually. So if you're assuming that you're in danger, you're going to move into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Yeah. So if there's a, and remember that all of this is actually happening in the physical here. So your freeze, fight, fright mode is always active, always. So until you can have a conversation with yourself or get a better understanding of what it is that you are making an assumption about, that link is always there. Because our security guard, as I call the amygdala, which is where that freeze, fight, flight area stems from, is actually on guard 24/7. It's constantly looking for danger for you, whether you are aware of it or not. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question or gives a perspective. Let me put it that way.
And then the last...
Yeah.
Sorry, Karin. Last question. Hopefully we've just got time to do this. It's at some point in the conversation, you might be discussing non-compliance. So this is obviously from a safety perspective. And how would you go about doing that if the other person is not willing to accept that you're talking about presumably their non-compliance?
I think there's different types of conversations, and this is now probably coming a little bit closer to understanding when people come into the job with a set of skills, knowledge, experience, and standard knowledge about standards. Now, if somebody is intentionally not being compliant with something, first of all, find out if they realize they're not being compliant. And that then would be that conversation. That would be the assumption that they're not being compliant. But if you can actually physically see it, that's a different type of conversation. I think that's more of a conversation about, a private conversation to the side and say, listen, what do you understand about the rules? What do you understand about the standards that we should be working under? And then pull information from that individual to find out why they are not being compliant. Sometimes there are hard conversations, So I think when we talk about conversational mastery, in many ways, it's about understanding that there are many different types of conversations. And sometimes we are not, particularly in leadership roles, we're not very good sometimes at actually having those tough conversations much sooner than we do. And then things fester. Because if you all think that person's never compliant, that why don't they do the right thing? Why are they not following the rules? The sooner you have that conversation with them by being open, sharing your assumptions or your story about the situation, the sooner you can get to the bottom of it, would be my take on that.
Lovely. I think that just brings us nicely to the end. Yeah, Ben, I don't know, another question's come in. Have we got time to answer it?
Look, I think that's a really big question, and I think it raises, because I can see it. So aside from demonstrating politeness, what methods can we employ to encourage workers from regions where a safety culture is considered a luxury to adhere to safety standards? Having worked around the world, I empathise with this question a lot. Everybody has different personal risk assessments or assumptions, or not just assumptions, but, the different understanding about what is risk. And that is a whole conversation in itself. And there's intercultural intelligence here as well. Some people live by rules, others do not. Many people, funny enough, and I'll stop on this one, will actually put their desire to be part of the team ahead of actually being safe or following the rules. So unwritten rules, the organisational culture, all of this becomes part of that bigger picture. That was a very good question, but a very big one.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for everybody's attendance and input and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.